Ready to restore relations. Russia's President Vladimir Putin said that Moscow is willing to resolve all the pressing issues that stop productive dialogue with Washington. His words follow a 3-hour face-to-face meeting between Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and his American counterpart Mike Pompeo, branded frank and detailed by both sides.
We also want to restore relations with the US. I hope all the conditions for that are now being created, despite the exotic way the Mueller Commission had been working. In the whole, it came up with an objective investigation and proved there was no collusion between Russia and the US, the thing we branded as total nonsense from the very beginning.
Let's go live to Sochi. Our correspondent Murad Gazdiev's been following events there. Murad, what else did Vladimir Putin have to say about that meeting?
Well, the main point, as you said, is that Vladimir Putin expressed hope that the preconditions are now right for relations between the United States and Russia, which, to be honest, have been awful, absolutely terrible. The two biggest nuclear superpowers in the world refusing to as much as talk to each other like children. Vladimir Putin saying that he hopes the preconditions are now right for those relations to improve, for any relations to be present at all, because all communications had until now been frozen pretty much. Military communication, cooperation in the financial spheres and trade and culture. And both him and Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, saying that they hope this might be a turning point. Vladimir Putin emphasizing certain spheres, certain topics in which Russia and the United States could easily cooperate, such as oil production, both among the top oil-producing countries in the world. They could talk about the market, supplying the global community, global demand. Also, Afghanistan. Both countries have a lot at stake there. Russia, especially with all the terror that's being exported out of Afghanistan, all the drugs. The United States, likewise, they could talk on North Korea, disarming North Korea, denuclearizing the peninsula, a whole host of topics. Vladimir Putin expressing hope that now, as I said, could be the turning point. Sergei Lavrov met with his American counterpart, as you mentioned, for 3 hours. We were there at the press briefing afterwards. They talked about almost every hot issue, hot topic in the world, every crisis that's happening in the world right now, starting, of course, with Venezuela. A chunk of their time spent on that. And on Venezuela, they agreed to disagree. But at least they're talking, and they promised to keep the conversation up. They have very different views on what's happening in Venezuela, starting with, of course, who the leader of Venezuela is. Russia backing President Nicolas Maduro, the United States backing Juan Guaido, and both countries pressing each other to sort of see things their way.
On Venezuela, we have disagreement. I urge my Russian colleagues to support the Venezuelan people as they return democracy to their country. The United States and more than 50 other nations agree that the time has come for Nicolas Maduro to go. He's brought nothing but misery to the Venezuelan people, and we hope that the Russians' support for Maduro will end.
Democracy can't be imposed by force. The threats coming both from US officials and the opposition leader Juan Guaido, who's always reminding us of the possibility of military intervention, have nothing to do with democracy.
The Russians and the Americans both saying pretty much the same thing, that Venezuelans should decide what happens to their countries, but how they see that happening seems to be very different. The United States saying that Russia, China, Iran, Cuba are interfering in Venezuelan politics. The Russians pointing out that Washington is threatening Maduro, the government of Venezuela, with intervention, with military action, invasion, which is also, the Russians say, meddling, interference. And they pointed out the 2003 invasion of Iraq in order to bring democracy to Iraq as an unsuccessful attempt at meddling. They also pointed out the 2011 invasion of Libya, where the United States was there to bring to bring democracy to Libya. Russians are saying, look how that turned out. Look at Libya now. They also spoke about continuing dialogue, continuing conversation, working on common ground. And I suppose that's the biggest takeaway out of all of this, that despite their differences and them agreeing to disagree, agreeing that their differences are severe, that they'll continue to talk, that they'll continue to try to find common ground. Iran, of course, similar to Venezuela, diametrically opposed views on what to do and how to go about solving the Iranian crisis, which has flared anew after the United States unilaterally pulled out of the Iranian nuclear deal of 2015. Now the situation is incredibly dangerous. It's on the knife's edge because Trump is threatening the Venezuelan people with, the Iranian people with suffering, the Iranian government with suffering unless it changes its course. We also have a United States aircraft carrier battle group stationed on Iran's doorstep in the Persian Gulf. And here again, both countries have very different views on how to go about resolving this crisis.
We have many disagreements on Iran now, but the fact that we've started talking on this issue gives us hope that we will be able to achieve agreements if both sides show willingness to do that.
I made clear that the United States will continue to apply pressure to the regime in Tehran until its leadership is prepared to return to the ranks of responsible nations that do not threaten their neighbors or spread instability or terror.
Interestingly enough, I was listening to Mike Pompeo's comments during the press briefing. He hardly ever mentioned the nuclear aspect of the Iranian crisis. He talked about at length about Iran's role in the Middle East, about its alleged meddling, its support for groups that the United States doesn't like, its, according to Mike Pompeo, its assassination rings in Europe. He hardly ever mentioned Iran's nuclear ambitions, which one would think would be a major sticking point. But again, Russia believing that the Iranian nuclear deal of 2015, along with the rest of the UN Security Council, the Europeans, that is the best way of going about and resolving this crisis. The United States, on the other hand, pressing the Europeans, pressing other countries to pull out of the Iranian nuclear deal, to pressure and sanction and hurt Iran, force it to change and do what the United States believes it should do. Nevertheless, even here, with such opposed views, Sergei Lavrov and Mike Pompeo said that conversation and dialogue between Russia and the United States should continue, that they should work on common ground, try to find a solution to this crisis that is acceptable to everyone, as indeed it must be in order to work. But aside from Venezuela, Iran, they talked about North Korea, remarking on solid progress that has been made. Both countries have very similar views on how to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, North Korea, how to make sure that it is verifiable that North Korea gives up its nuclear ambitions. They also talked about the crisis in the war in Yemen, in Syria, in Ukraine, and of course meddling. And the Russians insisting on what they have insisted for years, that there was no meddling, that not once has the United States come forward to the Russians and offered proof in writing, in facts, in figures of what it is that they accuse the Russians of doing, of how they meddled. The Russians say there won't be any grown-up conversation until that happens. The Americans on their behalf, on their side, saying that relations could only improve if meddling is in the past. Nevertheless, as I said, both countries, the biggest takeaway is that they have agreed to talk. They have agreed that dialogue rather than sanctions and militant rhetoric is the best way forward. And they've agreed to reopen previously suspended and shut channels of communication, military, financial, cultural, which is incredibly important. So cautious optimism, but stress on cautious.
Many thanks, our correspondent there with the latest live from Sochi. That's Murad Gazdiev. OK, let's bring in political analyst Lou Rockwell now to discuss this in a bit more depth. Good to have you on, Lou. So many subject matters that were touched upon, it seems, in the few hours of conversation between leading officials from Russia and the US. They can hardly have really done more than scratch the surface on such big topics. But the point was made there by a correspondent, the fact they're actually sitting down and talking. Does that bode well? Does this suggest to you that we're going to see improved relations?
Well, it certainly is a good step. And it's reminiscent of the sort of thing that used to happen during the Cold War, and that the U.S. has not, has blocked for some time. The U.S. President Trump says he wants better relations. He could stop all the military exercises right on Russia's border. He could lift the sanctions. He could allow Russia to participate in the SWIFT dollar exchange system. Many, many things that he could do. We hope he'll do it. He certainly campaigned on that. He campaigned on wanting better relations with Russia. But I must say, Mr. Pompeo seems to have no sense of irony. I mean, he's saying Iran must stop threatening other countries. Oh, well, does the U.S. threaten Iran and virtually every other country on earth? Is it the normal thing that the U.S. does? That Russia shouldn't meddle in Venezuela? The U.S. is doing unbelievably much worse than meddling. It's threatening to invade Venezuela. It's trying to overthrow the elected president. Juan Guaido was not elected. Maduro was elected. We can know he was elected because the opposition, which included Juan Guaido, they did not participate in the election. Only Maduro participated. So therefore, of course, he was elected. So it's I get a kick out of the fact that the U.S. mentions the Monroe Doctrine as if that were still in existence. President Monroe, by the way, said, very interestingly, we want Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, and we, in our turn, will stay out of Europe. Somehow that part of the Monroe Doctrine has been forgotten. It'd be nice to see at least that come back into action. But it's the U.S. meddles in Russia's elections. It meddles in every other country's elections on earth. The U.S. actually has an agency, the so-called National Endowment for Democracy, that meddles in other people's elections. It has a Democratic component, a Republican component, so each of the political parties can be in on the loot. But it's I can remember when Time magazine heralded the election of Boris Yeltsin by saying we elected our man, we got our man in as the president of Russia, and the issue of Time magazine talked about what the U.S. had done to bring about the election of Yeltsin, the corrupt and poor drunken guy. So this is what the U.S. does. They meddle everywhere. They seek to be the world government, and they can't stand Russia. They can't stand China. They can't stand Iran. Anybody who says we're not going to go along, we're not going to take orders. So I would love to see the U.S. become a country of peace. What kind of chance that is, I don't know. But they can at least not have a war with Russia. There are many, Professor Stephen Cohen and other Russia experts are fearing this. There could actually be a war with Russia the way the U.S. has been acting. So this meeting today is a good step backwards. President Trump and President Putin can meet at the G20. That's all to the good. Meetings, talks, bringing back military and other kinds of communication. Very, very good to prevent a war. I think that's what we have most to fear. And the U.S. can do many, many things. But of course, the Russia that they present, as your correspondent pointed out, no evidence whatsoever that Russia interfered in U.S. elections. In the so-called evil Mueller report, where they kept talking about the Russia interfered, but Trump wasn't involved. Well, that part, of course, was good. Trump wasn't involved. But again, these are just assertions. There's no proof. If there is proof, let them have it. By the way, Russia, I was so glad to see that Lavrov handed a report on U.S. intervention in Russia and Russian elections to the U.S., asking them to stop it. In all the unbelievable coverage on alleged Russian collusion and Russian interference in American elections, I never heard anybody on U.S. media ask, by the way, does the U.S. interfere in Russia's elections? Of course, the U.S. does attempt to interfere, and to the extent that if we can see the U.S. become a less warlike power, that would be a great thing. I hope to goodness they don't bomb Iran. They're treating Iran like demons.